So again, before we jump into the blind SQL injection, the dash is very important. It always comments out whatever is left over. We don't know where we are in the query, so we want to make sure if there are anything left over, we completely ignore it by giving it a dash and commenting out. Especially when it comes down to blind SQL injection. With the blind SQL injection, we're relying on conditions to be true in order to receive a response. So in other words, we're not seeing an error. There's no way of knowing if the thing that we're giving it, if that query is actually working out or not. So we have to give it a true condition. If that condition is met, we're going to look at the response and see if it's valid. So we talked about this early on. We're going to close the previous query. It could be a single quote, it could be quotations, whatever that is. And then we can say and 1 equals 1. Because in mathematics, 1 equals 1 is a true statement, we're going to come back with the application giving us some response that is not an error. That could be a 400 HTTP response code. It could be no data coming back. It could be a number of different things. You have to understand how the application works for the blind SQL injection to make sense. So again, for the second one, we're doing the same thing. We are giving it a true condition. It comes back and it works. But the last but not least, the third one is very important. Here we're saying, hey, I want you to finish the previous query, put in the double quotes, and 1 equals to 2, which is not valid. We know 1 doesn't equal to 2. It's not valid with math, and this is going to be an invalid condition, and we may get an invalid response. And that's kind of how we can actually confirm if a SQL injection exists. Simple math, we do 1 equals 1, true response, we get some sort of a valid response from the web server. 1 equals 2, we're not getting anything valid. It's going to give us some sort of an error that indicates, okay, maybe there's a SQL injection here. Let's look into it further. The way we can actually verify a SQL injection exists outside of giving it true conditions, we can use some functions that delays a response coming back from the server. So you can do this in two ways, depending on what backend you're using. The first way is to just say, hey, close the previous query, which is what we're doing here. We're saying and sleep 5, which is what we're doing here. What we're saying is one quotation mark that closes the previous query, and then we're going to say, hey, once that query is done, I want you to also do this sleep 5. So we say and sleep 5, and then we comment out the rest of the query if there's anything afterwards. And if there's a SQL injection here, the web server is going to take 5 seconds before it comes back and gives us a response. There's a number of different ways to do this depending on the backend SQL database, but at the end of the day, they all have similar functions where we can delay the response to confirm if our SQL injection exists. So in other words, to wrap it up, what we're doing here is we're closing the previous statement. Again, with SQL injection, you always want to close the previous statement, whatever that SQL query is, you want to close it. And then for blind SQL injection, you want to say, okay, here is a true statement. If this is valid, then I want you to sleep for 5 seconds. So expression is true, I want you to sleep for 5 seconds. But it doesn't have to always be a sleep function. We can actually guess the value that we're expecting. We can brute force for it by giving it different functions that are built in within the database query that they're using. So whatever the SQL language they're using, whatever the backend is, we have to go look at it and see what functions are available to us and use some of those to brute force it. So for example, in MySQL, we can use substring, which takes a string, start, and value. So if we are looking for particular information, we can say, hey, I want you to use substring, look for the string, and tell me if it's the first letter of it is equal to this. So in our first example, we have nahamsek. We're saying, hey, I want you to get the first letter starting at point 1. So we're saying nahamsek, start at point 1, the first letter, and give me the first value is at n. So if it is true, it's going to come back and give us no error. And if it's not true, it's going to give us some sort of an error indicating that it didn't work. So in the second line, we're saying select substring nahamsek, start at value 2, and give me the first letter. So we're getting an A back, which means the second letter of the string nahamsek. But we can also ask it to give us 2 letters back. So we can say, hey, start at position 1. This is where we start, and give me the first 2 letters, which is NA. So you can actually, instead of waiting for it to give it back to you, you can say, hey, does select substring nahamsek 1 equal n? If that is true, there's no errors, and if it's not true, then it's going to say, no, that is not correct. There's an error. I don't know what happened. So now we're going to use this functionality. This was an example. We're going to use this functionality and guess the MySQL version. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm saying, hey, I want you to use a substring, use the function at version, and I want you to see if starting at the first point value with the first position, does it start with a 5? If there's no error, it's going to come back and give us no error, which indicates that we are on version 5. And if there is an error, it's going to just give us an error like saying, hey, I don't know what happened. I don't know what I'm doing with this statement that you have given me. There is an error, so we can change it to 4, 3, hopefully not on a super old version. But the point is to show there are different methodologies that you can follow when it comes down to blind SQL injection to extract data and verify your vulnerability. Quickly, let's revisit all of this. I want to make sure you all understand this. The point of it is you want to make sure you are actually closing out the previous statement. You have to find out if it were using a single quote, double quote, whatever that was. You want to close it and then insert your own query within the next line. So right now we're doing 1. We know that they're putting the ID within 2 single quotes. So it goes equals to single quote, 1 single quote. We're closing it and then inserting our own statement. The biggest thing to understand for this chapter is how SQL works and how you can inject your SQL injection query, which is a regular SQL query, into this application and retrieve the data that you want. If you want to get better at SQL injection, my biggest advice is to look into a MySQL course, learn the basics, go to MySQL's website. They have great documentation, kind of understand the basics of SQL queries and take it from there.